The rain didn't just fall in the Black Ridge Mountains, it punished the earth. It turned the silver clay soil into a slick, treacherous graveyard and hammered against the roof of the lone line shack like 1,000 lead bullets. Inside, the air was a thick soup of cedar smoke, wet wool, and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. Aara Thornne stood pinned against the rough-hewn timber wall, her lungs burning as she tried to pull air through a throat constricted by terror and a strange, dizzying heat. Her back was pressed so hard against the logs that she could feel the splinters snagging the fine silk of her travel-worn dress. The cabin was small, a mere thumbprint of civilization in a vast, uncaring wilderness, and right now it felt like it was shrinking. The only light came from the dying embers in the stone hearth, casting long, flickering shadows that danced like demons across the ceiling. But the most terrifying shadow of all was the one currently eclipsing her. Standing over her was Jediah Cross. In the town of Stone Creek, they called him the Ghost of the Ridge, a name earned through years of tracking men who didn't want to be found and surviving wounds that would have put a lesser man in the dirt. Up close, he didn't look like a ghost. He looked like a force of nature. He was a mountain of a man, his shoulders broad enough to block out the world, his presence so heavy it seemed to tilt the very floorboards beneath them. He wore a long, dust-colored duster that was dark with rain, the heavy canvas smelling of wet earth and old leather. But it was his face that kept Ilara's heart trapped in her throat. A jagged, silvered scar tracked a brutal path from his left temple, cutting through his eyebrow and dragging down across his cheek to the edge of his jaw. It was a road map of a violent life, a history written in iron and pain. His eyes, a cold, piercing gray like a winter sky before a blizzard, were locked onto hers with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. Jediah stepped closer, his heavy spurred boots thudding against the floor with a slow, rhythmic finality. The vibration traveled up through the soles of Ilara's feet, settling in the pit of her stomach. He slammed a massive, calloused hand against a timber wall right beside her head, the impact making the entire shack tremble. He leaned down, his face inches from hers, bringing with him the scent of rain, bitter tobacco, and a primal masculine heat. His gaze raked over her, taking in her soaked auburn hair that had escaped its pins to cling to her neck, and the way her damp dress clung shamelessly to her curves. He saw the frantic pulse jumping in her throat, the way she was trying, and failing, to keep her chin high. A dark, cynical amusement flickered in his eyes, quickly replaced by something sharper and more dangerous. "You've got a lot of nerve, little girl," he growled, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in her very marrow. "Coming into a man's camp in the middle of a washout, looking like a lost lamb in a wolf's den. Do you even know where you are?" Aara swallowed, her mouth dry as desert dust. "I know who you are, Mr. Cross," she whispered, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "I'm not looking for trouble. I'm just looking for a place to stay the night." Jediah leaned in even closer, his nose brushing against her temple. He could feel the heat radiating from her skin, the way her chest heaved against his own. He inhaled deeply, the scent of her, something like lavender and rain, cutting through the grime of the cabin. His jaw tightened, the scar on his face turning a stark, angry white as he realized just how out of her depth she was. "Don't tell me you're a virgin," he rasped, the words a mix of a curse and a dark realization. "Because if you are, little girl, you've picked the worst possible man to hide with. I don't know how to be gentle with things that break, and I, sure as hell, don't know how to play the saint for a preacher's daughter." The mention of her father made Aara flinch. It was the title she had been running from for 3 days and 3 nights. To the world, she was the purest flower of Stone Creek, the daughter of the Reverend Jediah Thornne, a man who preached fire and brimstone while holding his daughter's life in a grip of iron. Her upbringing had been a meticulous prison of scripture and silence. She was never permitted to raise her voice, to look a man in the eye, or to feel the sun on her skin without a bonnet to shield her. Her life had been a series of no's until the ultimate yes was demanded of her. Her father had arranged a marriage to Silas Miller, a man with cold hands and a calculating heart who saw Aara as a prize to be displayed on his arm. The night before the wedding, as the heavy scent of lilies filled the rectory like a funeral, Aara had looked at the white lace gown laid out on her bed and seen a shroud. She realized that if she didn't leave then, she would never leave at all. She had stolen her horse, taken a handful of coins from her father's desk, and ridden into the darkness of the ridge. She had traded her reputation for the chance to breathe. But the mountains were not the Philadelphia streets she had read about in books. When the storm broke, it had been a wall of water that swallowed the trail and sent her horse bolting into the night. She had spent hours clawing through the brush, her silk slippers shredded, her hands bleeding, until she saw the faint glow of Jediah's fire. Now, she looked into the scarred face of the ghost and realized she had traded one master for another. But there was a difference. Her father's control was cold and stifling. Jediah's presence was hot and terrifyingly alive. "My father's house was a grave, Mr. Cross," Aara said, her voice gaining a strength she didn't know she possessed. She met his gray eyes, refusing to look away from the scar. "I didn't run away to find another saint. I ran away to find myself. If that makes me a sinner in your eyes, then so be it." Jediah's pupils blew wide, his eyes darkening until they were almost black. The restraint he had practiced for years, the walls he had built around his heart to keep the ghost at bay, began to crack under the weight of her defiance. He had spent his life among the worst of humanity, but he had never seen a creature as beautiful or as fragile as the woman currently defying him in his own cabin. "You think you've seen the devil because your father yelled at you from a pulpit?" Jediah asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. He reached out, his thumb catching the edge of her jaw, forcing her head back so he could see every flicker of emotion on her face. His skin was rough, like sun-baked earth, but his touch was unexpectedly steady. "I've seen the devil, Aara. I've seen him in the eyes of men I've had to put in the ground. I've seen him in the mirror. You don't want any part of what I am." "I think I'm the best judge of what I want," she countered. The air between them charged, a physical weight that made it hard to breathe. The 10K formula was in full effect. The giant and the wave, the scarred and the smooth, the dark and the light. He was everything she had been taught to fear, and yet, in the heat of his presence, the cold fear of her father seemed to melt away. Jediah looked at her lips, which were parted and swollen from the cold. He looked at the fire in her eyes, a fire that matched the embers in the hearth. He was a man of action, a man who had survived by taking what he needed and leaving the rest behind. But as he looked at Aara Thornne, he realized he couldn't just take her, and he certainly couldn't leave her behind. The storm outside seemed to reach a new height, a crack of thunder shaking the very foundations of the shack. It was as if the world itself were trying to break in, but Jediah didn't care. His world had narrowed down to the woman in his arms and the choice he was about to make. "If you stay," he rasped, his forehead dropping to rest against hers, "there is no going back. You won't be the preacher's girl anymore. You'll be mine. You'll eat my dust. You'll sleep in my bed, and you'll answer to no one but me. Do you understand what that means, Aara? It means you'll be an outcast. You'll be as much of a ghost as I am." "I was already a ghost, Jediah," she whispered, her hand rising to cover his on her jaw, her small fingers disappearing against his massive, scarred palm. "Tonight, for the first time in my life, I want to be flesh and blood." Jediah let out a low, guttural growl, a sound of pure, unadulterated surrender. He didn't say another word. He simply leaned down and captured her mouth with his. It wasn't a kiss of courtship. It was a claim. It tasted of rain, iron, and a desperate, long-buried need that had been waiting for 18 years to be set free. Aara let out a small, broken sound, her hands flying up to clutch at the lapels of his duster, her fingers digging into the hard muscle of his chest. The world outside, the Reverend, the marriage to Silas Miller, the proper life of Philadelphia, vanished into the roar of the wind. In that small, dark cabin, the preacher's runaway daughter had finally stopped running. She had found the one thing her father had never taught her, the power of her own desire. Jedidiah pulled back just an inch, his eyes searching hers for any hint of regret. He found none, only the same fierce, wild fire that was currently consuming him. He reached down, his hands finding the hem of her soaked dress, and for the first time in his life, the ghost felt like he was coming home. The morning light did not arrive with the golden warmth of a new beginning. Instead, it filtered through the cracks of the line shack in thin, sickly gray ribs, illuminating the dust motes that danced in, the stagnant air. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world that was bruised and sodden, the silence outside so absolute it felt heavy. Inside, the fire in the hearth had long since collapsed into a heap of white ash and glowing orange eyes, much like the life Aara Thornne had left behind in Stone Creek. Aara stirred beneath the heavy, scent-drenched weight of a buffalo robe. Her body felt different, heavier, yet somehow more anchored to the earth than it had ever been. There was a dull ache in her limbs, a physical reminder of the night's transformation, but it was overshadowed by a profound, quiet clarity. For 18 years, she had been told that sin would leave a mark upon the soul, a black stain that would wither the spirit. But as she lay there, listening to the rhythmic low thrum of the man sleeping beside her, she felt only a strange sense of wholeness. The cage was open. The bird had not only flown, it had learned to raptor. She turned her head slightly, her breath catching as she looked at Jediah Cross in the raw, unforgiving light of dawn. In the dark, he had been a shadow, a presence of heat and gravel tones. In the light, he was a map of survival. The jagged scar on his face was even more prominent now, a stark raised line of pale tissue that disrupted the rugged, handsome lines of his features. It wasn't just his face, though. As the robe slipped down, she saw the marks on his shoulders and chest, pucker marks from old lead, the long, faded welts of a lash, and the sheer corded power of a man who had spent his life fighting against the gravity of a hard world. He was magnificent in his ruin. As if sensing her gaze, Jedidiah's eyes snapped open. There was no slow transition from sleep to wakefulness. He went from stillness to total alertness in a heartbeat, his hand instinctively reaching for the peacemaker resting on the floorboards beside the bed. It was the movement of a man who had spent too many nights expecting a bullet to find him in the dark. When his eyes met hers, the cold, predatory sharpness softened, if only by a fraction. He didn't look at her with the lust of the night before, nor with the mocking cynicism he'd worn like armor when she first arrived. He looked at her with something more unsettling. Recognition. "You're still here," he rasped, his voice even deeper and rougher in the morning air. "Where else would I go?" Aara replied, her own voice steady. She reached out, her fingers hesitant before she steeled herself and traced the line of the scar on his jaw. He didn't flinch, but she felt the muscle beneath her touch jump. "The horse is gone, the trail is mud, and my father would have the bells tolling for a funeral if he saw me now." Jedidiah sat up, the buffalo robe falling away to reveal the raw, powerful landscape of his torso. He ran a hand through his dark, sleep-mussed hair and looked at the cold hearth. "He won't just toll bells, Aara. A man like Jediah Thornne, he's got a long memory and a short fuse when it comes to his pride. He didn't just lose a daughter last night. He lost his most precious piece of property. He'll come for you, and he won't come alone." "I know," she said, sitting up beside him, ignoring the way the cold air bit at her bare skin. She wrapped the robe around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on his. "But he's not looking for me. He's looking for the girl who sat in the front pew and kept her head down. That girl died in the rain, Jedidiah. Jedidiah looked at her then, really looked at her. He saw the bruises on her spirit healing even as the world prepared to break her. He stood up, moving with a startling feline grace for a man of his size, and began to pull on his clothes. The spurs on his boots clinked, a cold metallic sound that signaled the return of the ghost. "We can't stay here," he said, his tone shifting back to the professional detachment of a bounty hunter. "The line shack is too easy to find once the water recedes. There's a cabin 3 days west, deeper in the timber. It's rough, and the wind screams through the eaves, but it's high enough that we'll see anyone coming from 5 miles off." He paused, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife as he turned back to her. "But once we ride out that door together, Aara, there is no turning back. Not for you, and not for me. I'm a wanted man in 3 territories, and now you're the woman who ran with the ghost. They'll hunt us both." "Let them hunt," Aara said, standing up. The silk dress lay on the floor, a sodden, ruined heap of her past life. She looked at it with a cold detachment before turning to Jedidiah's saddlebags. She pulled out a spare wool shirt, massive on her frame, and a pair of buckskin leggings he kept for the winter. She dressed quickly, the rough fabric a stark contrast to the lace and silk she had worn her entire life. As she cinched a piece of rope around her waist to hold the leggings up, she felt a surge of something that felt suspiciously like joy. It was a hard, sharp joy, like the edge of a new blade. Jedidiah watched her, a strange expression crossing his scarred face. He had spent his life alone, a man of shadows and silence. He didn't want a partner. He especially didn't want a woman who carried the scent of a church and the eyes of a rebel. But as he watched her discard the last vestiges of her father's world, he felt a tethering pull in his chest that he couldn't explain. "Eat," he commanded, gesturing to a small tin of hardtack and some dried venison he had set out on the rickety table. "We ride in 20 minutes. The mud will slow the horses, but it'll slow the posse too. We need to put as much vertical distance between us and Stone Creek as we can." The next hour was a blur of calculated motion. Jedidiah moved with a quiet, lethal efficiency, erasing the traces of their presence in the shack while Aara packed what little food they had. She watched the way he handled his weapons, the way he cleaned the cylinder of his revolver, the way he checked the action of his Winchester. It was a ritual of survival, a prayer offered to the gods of powder and lead. When they stepped out onto the porch, the world was a cathedral of dripping pine and gray mist. The air was sharp enough to cut, smelling of ozone and wet earth. Jedidiah had managed to whistle in his spare horse, a sturdy, deep-chested bay, which had sought shelter in the lee of the ridge during the storm. He swung up into the saddle of his own black stallion, his movements effortless. He looked down at Aara, his hand extended. The power imbalance was still there, the giant and the girl. But as she took his hand and swung up behind him, her arms wrapping around his waist, the dynamic had shifted. She wasn't his prisoner. She was his shadow. "You ready, little girl?" he asked, his voice catching the wind. "Stop calling me that," she replied, her face pressing against the rough, rain-dampened leather of his duster. "I'm not a girl anymore, and I'm certainly not yours to mock." A rare, grim smile touched Jedidiah's lips, the first she had seen. It didn't reach his eyes, but it changed the set of his scarred jaw. "Fair enough, Aara. Hold on tight. The ridge is a cruel mother, and she doesn't like it when people try to leave her embrace." They set off, the horses picking their way through the treacherous mud. As they climbed higher, the air grew thinner and colder, the mist swallowing the line shack until it disappeared. Aara kept her eyes forward, her senses heightened to every sound. The snap of a branch, the cry of a hawk, the heavy rhythmic breathing of the man she had tied her fate to. She thought of her father, probably standing in his pulpit at this very moment, his face purple with rage as he told the congregation about the stain on his house. She thought of Silas Miller, the man who wanted to buy her like a head of cattle, likely counting his coins and planning her capture. She felt a momentary pang of guilt for the scandal she had caused, for the shame that would follow her name for generations. But then she felt the solid, unyielding strength of Jedidiah's back against her cheek. She felt the cold wind on her face, a wind that didn't smell like incense or old hymnals. It smelled like freedom. It smelled like the unknown. They rode for hours in silence. The only sound the squelch of hooves and the distant rumble of thunder that refused to fully dissipate. Jedidiah was constantly scanning the horizon, his hand never far from his rifle. He wasn't just riding. He was hunting for the safest path, reading the terrain like a book Aara had never been taught to read. By mid-afternoon, they reached a high plateau. The clouds broke for a fleeting moment, a spear of sunlight cutting through the gray to illuminate the valley below. In the far distance, Aara could see the tiny, insignificant speck that was Stone Creek. It looked like a toy town, a collection of matchbox buildings and ant-like people. "Look at it," Jedidiah said, pulling the horse to a halt. "That's the world you left behind. Most people spend their whole lives in that valley, Aara. They live, they work, they die, and they never once see what's on the other side of these peaks." "And what's on the other side?" she asked, her voice a whisper in the vastness. Jedidiah turned in the saddle, his scarred face close to hers. The sunlight hit his gray eyes, making them shine like polished steel. Hardship, cold, hunger, and a life where nobody tells you who to pray to or who to bed. It's a lonely kind of peace, Aara. You sure you're built for it? Aara looked from the town in the valley to the man before her. She saw the scar, the gun, the shadows in his eyes, and then she looked at her own hands, roughened, dirty, and free. "I'd rather be lonely on this mountain," she said firmly, "than surrounded by saints in that valley." Jedidiah nodded, a silent acknowledgement of her choice. He spurred the horse forward, and they plunged back into the timber. But as they disappeared into the trees, neither of them noticed the thin plume of smoke rising from the valley floor, the first sign that the Reverend's posse had already found the trail. The sanctuary Jedidiah had promised was less a home and more a fortress of rot and resolve. Perched on a jagged outcropping known as Dead Man's Finger, the cabin was a silver-gray husk of cedar that seemed to cling to the mountainside by sheer force of will. The wind here didn't just blow, it screamed, a high, lonesome sound that mimicked the cries of the restless spirits the Ute tribes claimed haunted these peaks. By the time they reached the porch, the horses were trembling, their breath coming in thick plumes of white vapor. Aara's legs felt like lead weights as she slid down from behind Jedidiah. Her body, unaccustomed to the grueling rhythm of mountain travel, was a map of aches. Every muscle she possessed felt like it had been stretched and hammered on an anvil. Jedidiah didn't offer a hand to help her up the steps. He was too busy scanning the tree line below, his eyes narrowed, his hand resting with habitual ease on the butt of his Winchester. "Inside," he ordered, his voice tight. "Don't light a fire yet. Smoke is a beacon, and the wind hasn't shifted enough to carry it north. We sit in the cold until the light fails completely." The interior of the cabin was a tomb of dust and shadows. It smelled of old pine needles and the lingering scent of wood smoke from a decade ago. Aara didn't complain. She sat on a low, three-legged stool, wrapping her arms around her chest, trying to stave off the shivering that had begun deep in her marrow. She watched the Jedidiah move. He didn't rest. He checked the perimeter, barred the heavy door with a beam of oak, and then sat by the narrow window, his rifle across his knees. For an hour, the only sound was the wind and the rhythmic snick-click of Jedidiah checking his ammunition. The 10K formula was shifting. The initial explosion of desire had cooled into a tense, vibrating awareness of the world outside trying to break in. "They're coming, aren't they?" Aara asked, her voice small in the vast, cold silence. Jedidiah didn't look back. "Your father didn't just lose a daughter. He lost his moral high ground. He'll burn half the territory to find you, just so he can be the one to cast the first stone. And Miller's got the money to hire the kind of men who don't care about the law. They're trackers, Aara. They don't look for footprints. They look for broken twigs and the way the grass leans. They're about 6 hours behind us. The weight of his words settled on her like a physical blow. 6 hours. It wasn't a lifetime. It was a countdown. Suddenly, Jediah stood and walked toward her. He didn't reach for her with the heat of the night before. Instead, he reached into the holster at his hip and pulled out a secondary weapon, a smaller, snub-nosed Colt. He held it out to her, the dark steel glinting in the twilight. "I can't always be the shield, Aara," he said, his voice dropping to a low, serious rumble. "If they find us, there's going to be lead in the air. If I go down, you don't surrender. You don't go back to that dress and that church. You understand me?" Aara looked at the gun. It was a heavy, ugly thing. It represented everything her father had preached against. He who lives by the sword shall die by the sword. But as she looked at Jediah's scarred face, she realized her father had lived by the sword of his tongue for years, and he was the one currently hunting her. She reached out and took the weapon. The metal was ice cold, the weight of it surprising her. Her hand shook, the barrel dipping toward the floorboards. "Easy now," Jediah murmured. He stepped behind her, his massive frame a wall of heat against her back. He reached around, his large calloused hands covering her small ones, guiding her grip. His touch was a jolt of electricity, a reminder of the fire that had consumed them in the line shack. His chest was a solid drum against her shoulder blades, his breath hot against her ear. "It's not a toy," he whispered. "It's a tool, like a hammer or a needle. You don't pull the trigger, you squeeze it. You breathe out, you find your mark, and you own the space between you and the target." He adjusted her fingers, his skin rough against hers. The intimacy of the moment was thick, a potent mix of danger and devotion. He was teaching her how to kill, and in doing so, he was giving her the ultimate form of freedom. "My father said guns were for the godless," Aara whispered, her eyes fixed on the side of the gun as she practiced aiming at a knot in the cabin wall. "Your father used fear to keep you in a cage," Jediah countered, his voice a low growl. "Fear is a weapon too. This just levels the playing field. If Silas Miller tries to put his hands on you again, you don't pray for him to stop. You make him stop." Aara felt a surge of cold, hard steel enter her own heart. She thought of Silas Miller's peppermint and rot breath. She thought of her father's belt. She squeezed her eyes shut for a second, then opened them, her gaze steady. She squeezed the trigger. The hammer clicked against an empty chamber with a sharp, final sound. "Good," Jediah said, his hands lingering on hers for a moment longer than necessary. He turned her around to face him, his gray eyes searching hers. "You've got the grit, Aara. I saw it the moment you walked into my camp. Most women would have broken by now. You're just getting started." He reached up, his thumb tracing the line of her lower lip.